January 1942. The south coast of England slept beneath a thick fog that rolled in from the channel like a living thing. Beneath the gray curtain inside a fenced naval testing site near Portsmouth, a handful of men stood at the edge of the dock. Their faces were pale under the harsh glow of floodlights. The sea was calm, the air sharp with salt and machine oil. A small vessel drifted beyond the harbor wall, its faint outline visible against the mist. Then, without warning, it faded, first from sight, then from the radar screen inside the bunker. Gone. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. One officer lowered his binoculars and looked toward a young scientist beside him. The man's hands trembled around his clipboard, the pencil shaking as if he were cold, though the night was windless. He had not just witnessed a test. He had watched something vanish from existence. Inside a bunker on the hill, a phone rang once. A coded message was transmitted to London. Object no longer visible on optical or radar. Hours later, Winston Churchill received the report, read it twice, and gave a quiet order to his aide. "Bury it," he said. "We were never here." For decades, Britain's official war records made no mention of what happened that night. Yet fragments survived in diaries and misplaced blueprints in the memories of sailors who swore they had seen ships fade into fog and return unharmed. They called it the Invisible Convoy. By the winter of 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its breaking point. German U-boats stalked the shipping lanes like wolves, sinking over 600,000 tons of Allied cargo every month. Convoys carrying food, fuel, and soldiers to Britain were being torn apart mid-ocean. Entire fleets vanished beneath the surface before rescue signals could even be sent. In London, Churchill called it the greatest threat of the war. "The U-boat peril," he said, "is the only thing that truly frightens me." Britain needed a miracle, and in war, miracles often came from the most unlikely places. At the Admiralty Research Establishment in Teddington, a small group of scientists led by physicist Dr. Henry Waddington and engineer Ernest Chalmers were already working on classified countermeasures. Their task to find a way to break the U-boat's advantage. Depth charges, sonar, and radar were improving, but never fast enough. The Germans adapted, learned, and struck again. Chalmers proposed something radical, an idea so absurd that naval officers laughed when they first heard it. What if, instead of finding and sinking U-boats, Britain made their own ships impossible to detect? The idea wasn't pure fantasy. Since 1940, research into electromagnetic fields and radar absorption had quietly begun across several Allied labs. Scientists had learned that certain shapes, coatings, and frequencies could distort radar signals, but Chalmers believed it could go further. If a ship could carry a synchronized magnetic generator system, its hull might distort not only radar, but also the magnetic fields that German torpedoes used for targeting. In theory, it could vanish from detection. Funding was scarce, but desperation has a way of bending rules. Under the cover name Project PCX, the team began experiments on decommissioned trawlers off the Hampshire coast. They attached experimental coils to the hulls and coated the decks with new chemical compounds designed to scatter light and absorb radio signals. On the night of January 17, 1942, one of those trawlers vanished from radar for 12 full minutes. Word reached Churchill's office within hours. To the Prime Minister, who was balancing the chaos of the Blitz and the looming Desert War, the report was electrifying, but also unsettling. He authorized a second phase under the utmost secrecy. The new goal: test the technology on a live convoy. The operation would be classified as Vesper. In March 1942, convoy HX-229 left Liverpool for Halifax. Among its 38 ships, 2 carried hidden equipment installed by Waddington's team. To the rest of the fleet, they were ordinary cargo vessels. For the scientists, they were ghosts in waiting. When the convoy entered the mid-Atlantic, the so-called Black Pit beyond Allied air cover, German U-boats began their attack. Radio intercepts show that at least 3 U-boat commanders reported visual confirmation of targets, then disappearance. One log, recovered after the war, reads, "Contact lost. Instruments malfunctioned. Believed atmospheric distortion. By dawn, the convoy regrouped. The 2 modified ships returned unharmed. They had been right in the path of attack, yet no torpedo had struck them. The official Navy report listed the cause as operational confusion. Unofficially, the Admiralty was stunned. Had Britain stumbled onto something that could change the war? Over the next months, the tests continued in silence. The media never heard a word. Even most naval officers were kept in the dark. Scientists worked in windowless huts along the coast guarded by armed sentries. Their project names changed weekly to obscure the trail. Operation Tether, Project Wavefield, Naval Light Absorption Unit. In a letter to the Admiralty dated July 1942, Waddington wrote, "We are closer than ever to producing a ship that can sail unseen, not by magic, but by the laws of physics. But the closer they came to success, the more dangerous it became. Magnetic generators overheated, sometimes burning through steel. Radar-absorbent coatings interfered with the ship's own communications. Crewmen reported dizziness, nausea, even hallucinations after long exposure to the field systems. In one test, a ship's compass spun uncontrollably for an hour, as if the ocean itself were disoriented. Some scientists began to wonder whether they were tampering with forces they didn't fully understand. Churchill visited the research site once, late in 1942. Witnesses remember him standing silently by the pier, cigar glowing in the fog, watching as a test ship shimmered under the spotlights and blurred into the mist. When it faded completely, he turned away and said quietly, "We must not let this get out. The enemy must never know we tried this." Operation Vesper continued until early 1943. On paper, it never existed. But in March that year, something went wrong. During a live demonstration near Scapa Flow, the experimental vessel HMS Hesper, fitted with the latest magnetic camouflage array, experienced a sudden surge. Witnesses claimed the ship's outline flickered like heat on asphalt, and then the generators failed catastrophically. The magnetic discharge crippled the navigation systems and caused a small onboard explosion. 2 engineers were killed. The official report listed electrical malfunction. The project was shut down within days. The secrecy was absolute. Documents were burned. Personnel were reassigned. Even the surviving scientists were forbidden to speak of it under threat of prosecution. Waddington left the Admiralty in 1944 and returned to academia. Chalmers joined another secret project, one so bizarre it sounded like science fiction. A proposal to build a floating aircraft carrier out of ice and wood pulp, codenamed Habakkuk. To most, it was madness. But behind the absurdity lay a pattern. Britain's wartime science had reached a point where imagination blurred with possibility. Though the Invisible Convoy experiments had failed operationally, they had proved one thing: radar invisibility wasn't impossible. It was simply ahead of its time. After the war, most of the surviving records were sealed under the Official Secrets Act. Some were destroyed outright. The few that remained, technical drawings, memos, and fragments of field logs, were stored in the Admiralty archives under radar countermeasures. For decades, they gathered dust. Then in the late 1970s, a naval historian named Dr. Alan Kerr stumbled across a reference while researching convoy tactics. The document was labeled Magnetic Shadow Experiments 1942. Curious, Kerr filed for access but was denied. The file remained restricted until 2003. When it was finally released, what he found was startling. Correspondence between Waddington's team and the Royal Navy describing tests to minimize radar cross-section and magnetic signature of surface vessels. The language was identical to what engineers would later use in the 1970s to describe stealth aircraft design. It became clear that the British scientists of 1942 had accidentally laid the groundwork for an entirely new form of warfare. They had been the first to understand that the key to survival was not armor, but disappearance. Modern historians believe that fragments of those experiments may have influenced later research in both Britain and the United States. During the Cold War, when American engineers began developing radar-absorbing materials and angular aircraft like the F-117 Nighthawk, they unknowingly echoed the same principles tested in Portsmouth decades earlier. A declassified British memo from 1943 even used the phrase, signal reflection reduction by surface geometry, nearly identical to the American term radar cross-section management. The irony was painful. The project that Churchill had buried out of fear and secrecy had, indirectly, shaped the future of stealth technology. For the men who worked on it, there was no glory, no medals. Their names rarely appear in history books. Yet their contribution to military science quietly endures in every stealth ship and aircraft that now moves unseen across the world's oceans and skies. Some of the surviving witnesses spoke years later, in cautious interviews for BBC and Channel 4 documentaries. One recalled, "The sea would glow faintly at night, and the ship's edges blurred like it wasn't fully there. We used to joke that the Germans wouldn't believe it even if they saw it." Another remembered Churchill's warning. He told us, "The world is not ready to know what you're doing." And he was right. By the time the project was fully declassified in the 2000s, most of those involved were long gone. But the documents tell their own quiet story of fear, genius, and a nation desperate to survive. The files are thin, but one handwritten note remains, signed with Churchill's initials dated February 1943. It reads, "Continue privately. Let it remain unseen." That single sentence captures the heart of the story. Britain had flirted with invisibility, not as a fantasy, but as a weapon. And when it worked even briefly, it frightened them. Looking back now, it's easy to see the Invisible Convoy as a scientific curiosity, a wartime oddity lost to secrecy and fear. But its legacy is everywhere. The principles it uncovered, wave, distortion, magnetic interference, signal scattering, formed the backbone of modern stealth engineering. The idea that saved ships in theory went on to protect aircraft in practice. There's a kind of poetic symmetry in that. What began as a desperate experiment in a fog-shrouded bay during Britain's darkest hours became a foundation of the invisible wars that define our age. And so the question remains, why did Churchill insist the world never know? Perhaps because in 1942, with Britain hanging by a thread, even the smallest hope had to remain hidden. Perhaps because the line between science and sorcery was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Whatever the reason, the order stood for 60 years. No mention, no acknowledgement. Only in the archives, buried beneath decades of dust, did the truth resurface. The secret project Churchill never admitted existed was not a myth. It was real. And it worked, just long enough to frighten its creators. Today, as modern warships glide silently through the world's oceans, their sleek surfaces deflecting radar, their presence masked by layers of magnetic coating, they carry with them a forgotten ghost from 1942. A reminder that invisibility, once dismissed as madness, was born in the fog of Britain's desperate war for survival. And though the men who built it are gone, their creation endures, not as a legend but as a whisper in every radar screen, a shadow in every dark sea, and a lesson in how close humanity came to mastering the unseen. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary weapon is the one the world was never meant to see.